This is Chapter 49 of Following the Equator. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Following the Equator by Mark Twain, Chapter 49. Pajamas. Day scene in India. Clothed in a turban and a pocket handkerchief. Land parceled out. Established village servants. Witches in families. Hereditary midwifery. Destruction of girl babies. Wedding display. Tiger persuader. Hailstorm discouragers. The tyranny of the sweeper. Elephant driver. Water carrier. Curious rivers. Arrival at Allahabad. English quarter. Lecture hall like a snowstorm. Private carriages. A milliner. Early morning. The squatting servant. A religious fair. He had had much experience of physicians, and said, "The only way to keep your health is to eat what you don't want, drink what you don't like, and do what you'd druther not." Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar. It was a long journey, 2 nights, 1 day, and part of another day, from Bombay eastward to Allahabad, but it was always interesting, and it was not fatiguing. At first the night travel promised to be fatiguing, but that was on account of pajamas. This foolish night dress consists of jacket and drawers. Sometimes they are made of silk, sometimes of a raspy, scratchy, slazy woolen material with a sandpaper surface. The drawers are loose elephant-legged and elephant-waisted things, and instead of buttoning around the body there is a drawstring to produce the required shrinkage. The jacket is roomy, and one buttons it in front. Pajamas are hot on a hot night, and cold on a cold night, defects which a nightshirt is free from. I tried the pajamas in order to be in the fashion, but I was obliged to give them up. I couldn't stand them. There was no sufficient change from day gear to night gear. I missed the refreshing and luxurious sense, induced by the nightgown, of being undressed, emancipated, set free from restraints and trammels. In place of that, I had the worried, confined, oppressed, suffocated sense of being abed with my clothes on. All through the warm half of the night the coarse surfaces irritated my skin and made it feel baked and feverish, and the dreams which came in the fitful flurries of slumber were such as distress the sleep of the damned, or ought to, and all through the cold other half of the night I could get no time for sleep, because I had to employ it all in stealing blankets. But blankets are of no value at such a time. The higher they are piled, the more effectively they cork the cold in and keep it from getting out. The result is that your legs are ice, and you know how you will feel by and by, when you are buried. In a sane interval I discarded the pajamas and led a rational and comfortable life thenceforth. Out in the country in India the day begins early. One sees a plain, perfectly flat, dust-colored, and brickyardy, stretching limitlessly away on every side in the dim gray light, striped everywhere with hard-beaten narrow paths, the vast flatness broken at wide intervals by bunches of spectral trees that mark where villages are, and along all the paths are slender women and the black forms of lanky naked men moving to their work, the women with brass water jars on their heads, the men carrying hoes. The man is not entirely naked. Always there is a bit of white rag, a loin-cloth. It amounts to a bandage, and is a white accent on his black person, like the silver band around the middle of a pipe-stem. Sometimes he also wears a fluffy and voluminous white turban, and this adds a second accent. He then answers properly to Miss Gordon Cummings' flashlight picture of him as a person who is dressed in a turban and a pocket handkerchief. All day long one has this monotony of dust-colored dead levels and scattering bunches of trees and mud villages. You soon realize that India is not beautiful. Still there is an enchantment about it that is beguiling, and which does not pall. You cannot tell just what it is that makes the spell, perhaps, but you feel it and confess it nevertheless. Of course, at bottom you know in a vague way that it is history. It is that affects you. a haunting sense of the myriads of human lives that have blossomed and withered and perished here, repeating and repeating and repeating, century after century and age after age, the barren and meaningless process. It is this sense that gives to this forlorn, uncomely land power to speak to the spirit and make friends with it, to speak to it with a voice bitter with satire, but eloquent with melancholy. The deserts of Australia and the ice barrens of Greenland have no speech, for they have no venerable history, with nothing to tell of man and his vanities, his fleeting glories and his miseries. They have nothing wherewith to spiritualize their ugliness and veil it with a charm. There is nothing pretty about an Indian village, a mud one, and I do not remember that we saw any but mud ones on that long flight to Allahabad. It is a little bunch of dirt-colored mud hovels jammed together within a mud wall. As a rule, the rains had beaten down parts of some of the houses, and this gave the village the aspect of a moldering and hoary ruin. I believe the cattle and the vermin live inside the wall, for I saw cattle coming out and cattle going in, and whenever I saw a villager he was scratching. This last is only circumstantial evidence, but I think it has value. The village has a battered little temple or two, big enough to hold an idol, and with custom enough to fat up a priest and keep him comfortable. Where there are Mohammedans, there are generally a few sorry tombs outside the village that have a decayed and neglected look. The villages interested me because of things which Major Sleeman says about them in his books, particularly what he says about the division of labor in them. He says that the whole face of India is parceled out into estates of villages, that 9/10 of the vast population of the land consists of cultivators of the soil, that it is these cultivators who inhabit the villages, that there are certain established village servants, mechanics, and others who are apparently paid a wage by the village at large, and whose callings remain in certain families and are handed down from father to son, like an estate. He gives a list of these established servants: priest, blacksmith, carpenter, accountant, washerman, basket-maker, potter, watchman, barber, shoemaker, brazier, confectioner, weaver, dyer, etc. In his day witches abounded, and it was not thought good business wisdom for a man to marry his daughter into a family that hadn't a witch in it, for she would need a witch on the premises to protect her children from the evil spells which would certainly be cast upon them by the witches connected with the neighboring families. The office of midwife was hereditary in the family of the basket-maker. It belonged to his wife. She might not be competent, but the office was hers anyway. Her pay was not high, 25 cents for a boy, and half as much for a girl. The girl was not desired because she would be a disastrous expense by and by. As soon as she should be old enough to begin to wear clothes for propriety's sake, it would be a disgrace to the family if she were not married, and to marry her meant financial ruin, for by custom the father must spend upon feasting and wedding display everything he had and all he could borrow, in fact, reduce himself to a condition of poverty which he might never more recover from. It was the dread of this prospective ruin which made the killing of girl babies so prevalent in India in the old days before England laid the iron hand of her prohibitions upon the piteous slaughter. One may judge of how prevalent the custom was by one of Sleeman's casual electrical remarks when he speaks of children at play in villages where girl voices were never heard. The wedding display folly is still in full force in India, and by consequence the destruction of girl babies is still furtively practiced, but not largely, because of the vigilance of the government and the sternness of the penalties it levies. In some parts of India the village keeps in its pay 3 other servants: an astrologer to tell the villager when he may plant his crop, or make a journey, or marry a wife, or strangle a child, or borrow a dog, or climb a tree, or catch a rat, or swindle a neighbor, without offending the alert and solicitous heavens. And what his dream means, if he has had one, and was not bright enough to interpret it himself by the details of his dinner. The 2 other established servants were the tiger persuader and the hailstorm discourager. The one kept away the tigers if he could, and collected the wages anyway. and the other kept off the hailstorms, or explained why he failed. He charged the same for explaining a failure that he did for scoring a success. A man is an idiot who can't earn a living in India. Major Sleeman reveals the fact that the trade union and the boycott are antiquities in India. India seems to have originated everything. The sweeper belongs to the bottom caste. He is the lowest of the low. All other castes despise him and scorn his office. But that does not trouble him. His caste is a caste, and that is sufficient for him, and so he is proud of it, not ashamed. Sleeman says, "It is perhaps not known to many of my countrymen, even in India, that in every town and city in the country the right of sweeping the houses and streets is a monopoly, and is supported entirely by the pride of castes among the scavengers, who are all of the lowest class. The right of sweeping within a certain range is recognized by the caste to belong to a certain member, and if any other member presumes to sweep within that range, he is excommunicated. No other member will smoke out of his pipe or drink out of his jug, and he can get restored to caste only by a feast to the whole body of sweepers. If any housekeeper within a particular circle happens to offend the sweeper of that range, none of his filth will be removed till he pacifies him, because no other sweeper will dare to touch it. And the people of a town are often more tyrannized over by these people than by any other." A footnote by Major Sleeman's editor, Mr. Vincent Arthur Smith, says that in our day this tyranny of the Sweepers' Guild is one of the many difficulties which bar the progress of Indian sanitary reform. Think of this: "The sweepers cannot be readily coerced, because no Hindu or Mussulman would do their work to save his life, nor will he pollute himself by beating the refractory scavenger." They certainly do seem to have the whip hand. It would be difficult to imagine a more impregnable position. "The vested rights described in the text are so fully recognized in practice that they are frequently the subject of sale or mortgage." Just like a milk route, or like a London crossing sweepership. It is said that the London crossing sweeper's right to his crossing is recognized by the rest of the guild, that they protect him in its possession, that certain choice crossings are valuable property and are saleable at high figures. I have noticed that the man who sweeps in front of the Army and Navy Stores has a wealthy South African aristocratic style about him, and when he is off his guard he has exactly that look on his face which you always see in the face of a man who is saving up his daughter to marry her to a duke. It appears from Sleeman that in India the occupation of elephant-driver is confined to Mohammedans. I wonder why that is. The water-carrier, Bhisti, is a Mohammedan, but it is said that the reason of that is that the Hindu's religion does not allow him to touch the skin of dead kine, and that is what the water-sack is made of. It would defile him. And it doesn't allow him to eat meat. The animal that furnished the meat was murdered, and to take any creature's life is a sin. It is a good and gentle religion, but inconvenient. A great Indian river, at low water, suggests the familiar anatomical picture of a skinned human body, the intricate mesh of interwoven muscles and tendons to stand for water channels, and the archipelagos of fat and flesh enclosed by them to stand for the sandbars. Somewhere on this journey we passed such a river, and on a later journey we saw in the Sutlej the duplicate of that river. Curious rivers they are, low shores a dizzy distance apart, with nothing between but an enormous acreage of sand-flats with sluggish little veins of water dribbling around amongst them. Saharas of sand, smallpox pitted with footprints punctured in belts as straight as the equator clear from the one shore to the other, barring the channel interruptions. A dry-shod ferry, you see. Long railway bridges are required for this sort of rivers, and India has them. You approach Allahabad by a very long one. It was now carrying us across the bed of the Jumna, a bed which did not seem to have been slept in for one while or more. It wasn't all river bed, most of it was overflow ground. Allahabad means City of God. I get this from the books. from a printed curiosity, a letter written by one of those brave and confident Hindu strugglers with the English tongue, called a Babu, I got a more compressed translation. Godville. It is perfectly correct, but that is the most that can be said for it. We arrived in the forenoon, and short-handed, for Satan got left behind somewhere that morning, and did not overtake us until after nightfall. It seemed very peaceful without him. The world seemed asleep and dreaming. I did not see the native town, I think. I do not remember why, for an incident connects it with the Great Mutiny, and that is enough to make any place interesting. But I saw the English part of the city. It is a town of wide avenues and noble distances, and is comely and alluring, and full of suggestions of comfort and leisure, and of the serenity which a good conscience buttressed by a sufficient bank account gives. The bungalows, dwellings, stand well back in the seclusion and privacy of large enclosed compounds, private grounds, as we should say, and in the shade and shelter of trees. Even the photographer and the prosperous merchant ply their industries in the elegant reserve of big compounds, and the citizens drive in there upon their business occasions. And not in cabs. No, in the Indian cities cabs are for the drifting stranger. All the white citizens have private carriages, and each carriage has a flock of white-turbaned black footmen and drivers all over it. The vicinity of a lecture hall looks like a snowstorm, and makes the lecturer feel like an opera. India has many names, and they are correctly descriptive. It is the land of contradictions, the land of subtlety and superstition, the land of wealth and poverty, the land of splendor and desolation, the land of plague and famine, the land of the thug and the poisoner, and of the meek and the patient, the land of the suttee, the land of the unreinstatable widow, the land where all life is holy, the land of cremation, the land where the vulture is a grave and a monument, the land of the multitudinous gods, and if signs go for anything, it is the land of the private carriage. In Bombay the forewoman of a millinery shop came to the hotel in her private carriage to take the measure for a gown, not for me, but for another. She had come out to India to make a temporary stay, but was extending it indefinitely. Indeed, she was proposing to end her days there. In London, she said, her work had been hard, her hours long. For economy's sake she had had to live in shabby rooms and far away from the shop, watch the pennies, deny herself many of the common comforts of life, restrict herself in effect to its bare necessities, eschew cabs, travel third class by underground train to and from her work, swallowing coal smoke and cinders all the way, and sometimes troubled with the society of men and women who were less desirable than the smoke and the cinders. But in Bombay, on almost any kind of wages, she could live in comfort, and keep her carriage, and have 6 servants in place of the woman-of-all-work she had had in her English home. Later, in Calcutta, I found that the Standard Oil clerks had small one-horse vehicles, and did no walking, and I was told that the clerks of the other large concerns there had the like equipment. But to return to Allahabad. I was up at dawn the next morning. In India the tourist servant does not sleep in a room in the hotel, but rolls himself up head and ears in his blanket and stretches himself on the veranda, across the front of his master's door, and spends the night there. I don't believe anybody's servant occupies a room. Apparently the bungalow servants sleep on the veranda. It is roomy, and goes all around the house. I speak of men servants. I saw none of the other sex. I think there are none, except child nurses. I was up at dawn, and walked around the veranda, past the rows of sleepers. In front of one door a Hindu servant was squatting, waiting for his master to call him. He had polished the yellow shoes and placed them by the door, and now he had nothing to do but wait. It was freezing cold, but there he was, as motionless as a sculptured image, and as patient. It troubled me. I wanted to say to him, "Don't crouch there like that and freeze. Nobody requires it of you. Stir around and get warm." But I hadn't the words. I thought of saying, "Jaldi jao," but I couldn't remember what it meant, so I didn't say it. I knew another phrase, but it wouldn't come to my mind. I moved on, proposing to dismiss him from my thoughts, but his bare legs and bare feet kept him there. They kept drawing me back from the sunny side to a point whence I could see him. At the end of an hour he had not changed his attitude in the least degree. It was a curious and impressive exhibition of meekness and patience, or fortitude, or indifference, I did not know which. But it worried me, and it was spoiling my morning. In fact, it spoiled 2 hours of it quite thoroughly. I quitted this vicinity then, and left him to punish himself as much as he might want to. But up to that time the man had not changed his attitude a hair. He will always remain with me, I suppose. His figure never grows vague in my memory. Whenever I read of Indian resignation, Indian patience under wrongs, hardships, and misfortunes, he comes before me. He becomes a personification, and stands for India in trouble. And for untold ages India in trouble has been pursued with the very remark which I was going to utter but didn't, because its meaning had slipped me, "Jeldi jao!" Come, shove along. Why, it was the very thing. In the early brightness we made a long drive out to the fort. Part of the way was beautiful. It led under stately trees and through groups of native houses, and by the usual village well, where the picturesque gangs are always flocking to and fro and laughing and chattering. And this time brawny men were deluging their bronze bodies with the limpid water, and making a refreshing and enticing show of it. Enticing, for the sun was already transacting business, firing India up for the day. There was plenty of this early bathing going on, for it was getting toward breakfast time, and with an unpurified body the Hindoo must not eat. Then we struck into the hot plain, and found the roads crowded with pilgrims of both sexes, for one of the great religious fairs of India was being held just beyond the fort, at the junction of the sacred rivers, the Ganges and the Jumna. 3 sacred rivers, I should have said, for there is a subterranean one. Nobody has seen it, but that doesn't signify. The fact that it is there is enough. These pilgrims had come from all over India. Some of them had been months on the way, plodding patiently along in the heat and dust, worn, poor, hungry, but supported and sustained by an unwavering faith and belief. They were supremely happy and content now. Their full and sufficient reward was at hand. They were going to be cleansed from every vestige of sin and corruption by these holy waters, which make utterly pure whatsoever thing they touch, even the dead and rotten. It is wonderful, the power of a faith like that can make multitudes upon multitudes of the old and weak and the young and frail enter without hesitation or complaint upon such incredible journeys, and endure the resultant miseries without repining. It is done in love, or it is done in fear. I do not know which it is. No matter what the impulse is, the act born of it is beyond imagination marvelous to our kind of people, the cold whites. There are choice great natures among us that could exhibit the equivalent of this prodigious self-sacrifice, but the rest of us know that we should not be equal to anything approaching it. Still, we all talk self-sacrifice, and this makes me hope that we are large enough to honor it in the Hindoo. 2 millions of natives arrive at this fair every year. How many start and die on the road, from age and fatigue and disease and scanty nourishment, and how many die on the return, from the same causes, no one knows. But the tale is great, one may say enormous. Every 12th year is held to be a year of peculiar grace. A greatly augmented volume of pilgrims results then. The 12th year has held this distinction since the remotest times, it is said. It is said also that there is to be but one more 12th year for the Ganges. After that holiest of all sacred rivers will cease to be holy, and will be abandoned by the pilgrims for many centuries. How many, the wise men have not stated. At the end of that interval it will become holy again. Meantime, the data will be arranged by those people who have charge of all such matters, the great chief Brahmins. It will be like shutting down a mint. At a first glance it looks most unbrahmanically uncommercial, but I am not disturbed, being soothed and tranquilized by their reputation. Brer Fox he lay low, as Uncle Remus says, and at the judicious time He will spring something on the Indian public which will show that he was not financially asleep when he took the Ganges out of the market. Great numbers of the natives along the roads were bringing away holy water from the rivers. They would carry it far and wide in India and sell it. Tavernier, the French traveler, 17th century, notes that Ganges water is often given at weddings, each guest receiving a cup or two, according to the liberality of the host. Sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 rupees worth of it is consumed at a wedding. The fort is a huge old structure, and has had a large experience in religions. In its great court stands a monolith which was placed there more than 2,000 years ago to preach Buddhism by its pious inscription. The fort was built 3 centuries ago by a Mohammedan emperor, a re-sanctification of the place in the interest of that religion. There is a Hindu temple, too, with subterranean ramifications stocked with shrines and idols. And now the fort belongs to the English, it contains a Christian church, insured in all the companies. From the lofty ramparts one has a fine view of the sacred rivers. They join at that point, the pale blue Jumna, apparently clean and clear, and the muddy Ganges, dull yellow and not clean. On a long curved spit between the rivers, towns of tents were visible, with a multitude of fluttering pennons, and a mighty swarm of pilgrims. It was a troublesome place to get down to, and not a quiet place when you arrived, but it was interesting. There was a world of activity and turmoil and noise, partly religious, partly commercial, for the Mohammedans were there to curse and sell, and the Hindus to buy and pray. It is a fair as well as a religious festival. Crowds were bathing, praying, and drinking the purifying waters, and many sick pilgrims had come long journeys in palanquins to be healed of their maladies by a bath, or, if that might not be, then to die on the blessed banks and so make sure of heaven. There were fakirs in plenty, with their bodies dusted over with ashes, and their long hair caked together with cow-dung. For the cow is holy, and so is the rest of it, so holy that the good Hindu peasant frescoes the walls of his hut with this refuse, and also constructs ornamental figures out of it for the gracing of his dirt floor. There were seated families, fearfully and wonderfully painted, who by attitude and grouping represented the families of certain great gods. There was a holy man who sat naked by the day and by the week on a cluster of iron spikes, and did not seem to mind it. And another holy man who stood all day holding his withered arms motionless aloft, and was said to have been doing it for years. All of these performers have a cloth on the ground beside them for the reception of contributions, and even the poorest of the people give a trifle and hope that the sacrifice will be blessed to him. At last came a procession of naked holy people marching by and chanting, and I wrenched myself away. End of chapter 49.